and welcome to this podcast series on food authenticity. My name is Will Souter. In this episode, we have two fantastic guests. Ron Phipps is a prolific writer and speaker on the issue of authenticity in the honey industry, and Michael Roberts is a law professor from UCLA who specializes in food law and policy. I'll let them both introduce themselves in a little more detail. Make sure you go back and listen to episodes 1 and 2 of this podcast, which are presentations from Michael and Ron respectively, about their work and their views on the current state of the honey industry. Ron and Michael have worked together before on a number of projects, so in this conversation they were interviewing each other as much as I was interviewing them about the wide-ranging impacts of food safety, authenticity and adulteration, and some of the measures that can be taken to protect consumers and producers. So without further ado, here's the conversation with Ron Phipps and Professor Michael Roberts. I hope you enjoy it. Hi guys, thanks for joining me today.
A pleasure.
So do you want to start off with just introducing yourselves? Michael, do you want to go first? Just tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Sure. I'm a professor of practice and the executive director of the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law. And I've been in the field of food law now for about 18, 19 years, taught the very first food law class in the food law and policy class at the University of Arkansas many years ago when I was on the faculty there. And since then, this field has really grown to about 40 different law schools that are now teaching this course or a course like it. I write books and articles, and I teach here at UCLA. In fact, I teach my first class for this semester tomorrow night, and we collaborate and work with good folks like Ron Phipps and others around the world. That's great. Thank you for that. And Ron, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself as well?
I'm Ron Phipps. I have many hats like Michael does. My original background is in theoretical physics, but somehow I wound up engaged in trade. Currently, I'm vice president of a scientific committee of the World Honey Congress, Apimondia. And we're involved in the science of honey and been fighting food fraud. I've written many articles and chapters in books and lectures all over the world regarding the plague of food fraud and the consequences of food fraud to consumers, to ecology, to the global food security.
That's great. Thank you for that. So we're talking about food fraud today and honey fraud specifically. This is a big, complex issue with a lot of angles to consider. So just to get things started, maybe we could define some terms as a sort of introduction for people who might not be familiar with the issue. What do we mean when we say food fraud? Ron, could you take that first? How do you define that term?
Well, I think we have to recognize there is really twin sisters here. One is food fraud, and the second is economically motivated adulteration. And it's the adulteration and its economic benefits, though those benefits are illicit, which are the progenitors of the food fraud. The consequences to food fraud are very significant. In the case of honey, the consequences range to not only deception of consumers, but also to jeopardizing ecological sustainability, which is increasingly an issue of concern, especially to young and educated consumers as we see our environment under increasing stress. And because bees are the engineers, the conveyors of pollination, the bees are essential to global food security. And this food security has two aspects. One aspect is quantitative. The pollination, in some countries, it represents 35% of the food supply. In other countries, it represents 75%. So we're not talking about a trivial matter quantitatively. And of course, that becomes more acute in circumstances when the environment is itself stress. And the second aspect is the qualitative aspect. The crops that bees pollinate include oranges, lemons, blueberries, cranberries, apples, etc. And these are phytochemically rich foods. So it's not just the economic costs, it's also the health costs. Because if we jeopardize those foods that are key to preventive medicine, to strengthen immune systems, we're really playing with fire. And I think we have to recognize the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of food fraud are merged.
Michael, do you have a comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think for folks that are being introduced to this concept for the first time, imagine yourself going to the grocery store and you pick up a bottle of olive oil. And it may be that olive oil is labeled 100% extra virgin, but it's something different than that. It could be what we call pomace, which is really sort of the hot dog version of a steak, and it's less than quality olive oil. And there's a reason for that. This is adulteration. It's economically motivated adulteration, or known as food fraud. Or you want to go to a sushi bar and you think that you're getting snapper, and really, in fact, it's tilapia. Or you buy a jar of honey, and it's something that's very different than the honey that you would buy if it was made here in the United States, and it wasn't filled with imported honeys that may have impurities and substitutions and things that are added to it to make it less than the honey that you're expecting to get. So in other words, you're not getting the benefit of your bargain. Secondly, oftentimes food fraud can result in safety issues, and it can harm people. This is when the government does pay attention. So if you go all the way back to 2006, there was a significant problem that caught the attention of the world, and that was the melamine that was added to infant formula for children and to pet food in China. And that led to a number of deaths, both pets and infant children in China, unfortunately. It also caught the attention of the world, and as a result, there were hearings actually in Washington, D.C. with the FDA here at the U.S. focusing on economically motivated adulteration. Now, what happens when there isn't a safety issue? If there isn't a safety issue, then usually fraud falls into a low priority for the government. And that's unfortunate because people get away with it. And it becomes almost second nature for fraudsters in the food supply system. In fact, they stop thinking about it after a while, I have found. And so the level of fraud we've only really, I think, hit the tip of the iceberg. I think there's more of a problem than we anticipate simply because we don't know how to measure it, we don't know how to find it, and we oftentimes don't know that it's fraudulent until we really dig into it and do a really thorough investigation. So everything from dietary supplements to organic food to, you name it, there's some level of fraud. But in order for it to be a priority, to catch the attention of the regulators, it has to unfortunately become a food safety issue. And that's really part of the problem here, is we don't have a governance system that addresses the problem.
May I add just this point? The food safety issue, we have to learn to look at in a deeper way, both tactically and strategically. And I think the response of the government, of the U.S. government, governments in Germany and other countries, even the Chinese that are responsible for a lot of the adulteration and the methods of adulteration, the Chinese are very concerned about this. And the strategic part is, if we jeopardize global food security, that is a safety issue. It's a safety issue that affects humanity. And I think the media attention, the government attention, which has increased in the U.S. and is increasing, I think it's all because we're learning to look at this, not just what's before our nose, but looking down the road and seeing the strategic implications of adulteration.
One of the keys here, too, is that we oftentimes think of the government as this monolithic institution that regulates food, and that's not the way it works. One of the problems we have is food regulation is very fragmented. There's over 15 agencies that regulate food, for example, in the United States. And one of the reasons why the government's focused on food safety, for example, makes a lot of sense. The FDA, which is the lead agency, really is a public health agency, although it has other responsibilities. But it makes sense that governments around the world who have a public health orientation to food would be most interested in whether or not there's a public health issue. And so you have to think about this issue holistically in what we call food systems thinking. In other words, we have to think across the boundaries of agencies and try to come up with solutions both in public-private partnerships. There's not a government in the world that wants to have food fraud. They all mean well. And agencies that I discuss this issue with, no matter what country they're in, they all want to solve the problem. But we're sort of hindered by this fragmented approach to regulating food, and it makes it that much more difficult.
Well, I think as well, the modes of food fraud and adulteration have become more and more sophisticated.
Definitely.
And they're not only a case of exporting adulterated products, but there's also the export of methods of adulteration. For example, there's a method of adulteration which the FDA ruled on is illegal for any product that's called honey. It's Resnick technology. That removes antibiotics, removes offensive colors, flavors, etc. But it's illegal for the use in food products. That method has been exported to many countries. It began in China and is widely advertised on Chinese websites as advertised blatantly as means to elude detection by the U.S. government and the U.S. FDA.
It's a little like putting your finger in the dike in the water.
Yes.
You put your finger there, stop the water, and it pops out somewhere else.
Yes.
Dealing with food fraud is a little bit like that, actually.
Well, what I was wanting to ask you follows up on that comment. I've advocated and written about the need for extensive collaboration between government, academic, and private laboratories. I see that developing more and more, and I see also it's being resisted by those industries often most plagued by adulteration and food fraud, wanting to police themselves. So what could you say about this contradiction between industries trying to police themselves and the need for collaboration between governments, academic, and private laboratories, especially as the modes of adulteration become so sophisticated?
Well, to use another metaphor that I've heard you often use, one has to be aware of foxes in the hen house.
Yeah.
There's a difference between fraud and food safety, which is interesting, and I think it points directly to this problem. When it comes to food safety, every stakeholder, every manufacturer, every store, every person in the system wants the food to be safe because there's no advantage to having unsafe food, none whatsoever. But with food fraud, it's different. There is an advantage for some people to fight against wanting food to be authentic. There's that economic advantage, gaining that undue advantage. And so I always remind folks that when they try to set up platforms for collaboration and cooperation, to remember that not everyone in that industry is going to be in favor of this because they're going to lose their economic gain. And that can be a challenge because you don't often know who they are. Folks are trying to work behind the scenes, and they use all sorts of methods in addition to just the cheating itself, to camouflage, to divert attention, to hide what they're doing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fraud in the first place. And so it's really hard to have all hands on deck, all on the same page. And that's why you have to have some control systems in place. You have to have some level of enforcement.
Yes. It's not hard only. It's impossible. Because the economic motivation of adulteration is real. And the collusion that is involved is very sophisticated. Fortunately, a lot of that has been exposed.
I wish we could do it in the old days, what they used to do in England back in the early medieval days, when they would actually require the bakers to put their initials on loaves of bread. And they did that because oftentimes the bakers would load up the bread with lead in order to make it heavier. And so you take the bread home, you open the bread up, and you discover all this lead in there. Well, if you know the initials, if the initials are on there, this is the first form of traceability, actually. Then you go to the authorities, and they would actually put the baker or the offending party in a pillory, and they would walk them around the community. And you could throw all kinds of debris at the baker and mock them, and throw junk and garbage and other unspeakable things at the baker. That's an interesting enforcement regime, and we haven't been able to match that in modern times, but
Yeah.
it is very similar.
I think that's a risk companies are very conscious of these days, that if they get caught doing something consumers don't like, then they may well get pilloried on social media.
Exactly. And I think the mobilization of the younger generation and people are educated to these issues is a key factor. I like the metaphor of many tributaries flowing into a great river. And the tributary of consumer awareness is very important. People that are engaged in and benefit from adulteration and fraud, they're often the typical bully. And they can bully the weak members of the industry. We've seen them boycotting, ostracizing, disparaging methods like nuclear magnetic resonance that exposes modern modes of fraud in the fish area, in wines and alcohol, coffee, olive oils, fruit juices, honey, etc. But when they're confronted, and I think this is one reason corporate responsibility, social responsibility is a key factor. When they're confronted with people more powerful, like the typical bully, they become very meek. And I think that bottom-up pressure from consumer and top-down pressure from corporate leadership is crucial.
I think there's also a component of equality here, too, that we shouldn't lose sight of. So I live in Los Angeles, and because I know about food fraud and food issues, and a lot of my students do as well, and people I'm associate with, I know where to go to buy really good olive oil. I can go to this little store in Beverly Hills. I pay an arm and a leg for it. Or I can go to any sort of value-add store and buy it. I can buy maple syrup, really expensive maple syrup. I know I can go to the farmer's market and get pretty good honey if I have a trusted source. And I know I can go to certain sources and get fish where I'm pretty confident it is what it purports to be. And same with juices and all the other products out there. So we create a system where we can buy authenticity. But what about the folks who can't afford to buy those kinds of food products? So I think there's an element of justice and equality here that's sometimes overlooked. We don't want to create two different grades of consumers, those who can afford authenticity and those who can't. It's not consistent with the ideals that we have in just about any government, especially here in the U.S. And so I think that there is that piece to it that we don't oftentimes pay attention to.
Correct.
Yeah, that is an interesting aspect for sure. So just bringing it around to the reports that both of you have been working on recently, it seems like this year in 2020, there's a number of key changes in industry attitudes, media and public awareness that all seem to be coming to a head to some extent. So Michael, first, you've been working on a report for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. What have you seen in your work from an international legal standpoint? How are things progressing, and what changes might we hope to see over the next couple of years?
Sure. And of course, I speak just on my behalf, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the FAO and what they officially decide to do. But what I've learned in my own studies, and I've been involved in this for a long, long time, from wearing my legal hat, I think that, again, complicated problem, requires cooperative response from both the government and from the private sector. And I think the media, as Ron has mentioned, is playing an important part of that, is drawing attention to this issue. And so I'm optimistic because I think that the trajectory right now is in the right direction. And I think that we can actually solve this problem or at least make considerable inroads because we have the attention of the private sector in a way we haven't had for a long, long time. And because consumers are interested in it. This issue wouldn't be in front of the FAO if that were not the case. And every once in a while, there's a food safety issue that results from this, whether it's an allergen that's part of a spice that was unintended, or the unintended consequences of honey, for example, on the ecosystem, or a food safety issue. Those draw attention to it. But the common everyday fraud that's committed is really difficult. But I do think that partnership is going to happen. It is happening. It's just a matter of trying to accelerate it. That's the big question. How quickly can we move? But we live in a time and an era where I think you've got counter forces to that. It's not easy sometimes for governments to work together. And, China has to be part of this equation. And they've got to be an important part of this equation. And they will be, I think, if we approach it in the right way, as do other Asian countries. I don't want to just single out China, as do other Asian countries as well, and to ensure that we've, and I have to say this, I teach in China. I've been teaching in China now for over a decade at different law schools. They're just as concerned, the consumers are just concerned about this issue, if not more so, than consumers are here in the U.S. And so that's a universal given. And for that reason, I think I have some level of optimism, is that consumers don't want to live in this kind of a food system.
I can second that. I've taught in China other subjects in food fraud and adulteration, more in philosophy and physics and education theory. But the Chinese are the most acute victims of food fraud and corruption and adulteration. I could give many examples of this. Some are very poignant that led to deaths. So it's a universal problem and it requires a universal solution. It's a common problem for humanity, and that's why it has its international dimension.
We're just going to take a short break from this conversation now to talk about why we're discussing this issue of food authenticity. Bruker's food screener instruments use an automated NMR spectroscopy platform to quantify the hundreds of distinct compounds present in a complex substance like honey. Using statistical modelling, this honey profile can be used to detect adulteration or false labelling, and even determine geographical and botanical origins. Ron is going to tell us more about how this powerful technique is impacting the landscape of the honey industry in North America. But if you want to learn more about the food screener itself, or if you're interested in how you could verify the authenticity of food products that you make or distribute, please do reach out to Bruker's experts at bruker.com/foodscreener. So, Ron, you just published a great market report as well on the honey industry. A key part of that was on how attitudes have changed recently on advanced testing methods like NMR. Could you talk a little bit about the technical aspects of how honey gets adulterated? As you've mentioned, the techniques that are being used are getting more sophisticated. So it must be important for testing methods to keep in step, right? And to have tests available which can detect these newer methods of fraud?
Important question and a site of important progress. Nuclear magnetic resonance testing has associated with it 6 Nobel Prizes. So this is a very sophisticated method to delve deeper into the molecular structure, how nuclei of different molecules resonate. The importance of this, the value, the power of NMR, and it's not the only tool in the toolbox, but it's the most powerful, is that it can recognize multiple variables, 36 variables and maybe more. And that is very crucial. One of the first things that came up about NMR was that it can distinguish between nectar. We talked about immature honey, unripened honey, extraction of honey. If you extract it in 6 hours, 8 hours, 1 day, rather than 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, the quantities you can produce are enormous. But the bees interact with the nectar, and they add components to that, and they alter it. They transform nectar into honey. NMR can show the profile of these multiple variables, and no other test can show that multiplicity of variables in honey like NMR can. And that can show the difference between nectar and honey. That was one of the first manifestations. I had worked with the FDA, scientists and mathematicians in the late 90s on the need for new, more sophisticated technologies. And that was before we realized how sophisticated and novel the methods of adulteration that were being brought to bear are. And it is not merely a question of honey. Frozen fish, Michael talked about Freud in fish. Well, fresh fish is much more expensive than frozen fish. It creates an enormous premium. NMR can test if the fish is frozen on the boat and then defrosted and sold as fresh fish. And it's exactly because it's so powerful that there were people who opposed it. And there's a lot of supporting information to the background. Professor Norberto Garcia, myself, and Richard A.D., the A.D.s are the biggest beekeepers in the world. We introduced a chart which showed the huge exponential rise of exports, but the number of beehives were flat, and the productivity, due to environmental stress, declined. So the contradiction became very clear. In Apimondia, there are 5 or 6 scientists who all quoted this. So the problem became undeniable. But they didn't want to sanction NMR. So we saw for 5-6 years disparagement of this technology. But as people explored the science, the database, it became irresistible. So those who had opposed it could no longer do it. So this is one of the key tools. It's not the only tool, but it's by far the most powerful. And it's essential to exposing those types of fraud, which are plaguing the honey industry, and, to use Michael's poignant phrase, endangering the beekeepers who tend to the pollinators of our world.
Absolutely. And Michael, do you have a comment on that from your point of view?
Well, I think it's a really valuable tool. I think that, and I think Ron will agree with me, we're never really going to test our way out of food fraud. There's got to be a balance between, testing is really a control method, and it can be part of the preventive method as well. But sometimes I've always felt we put too much emphasis on the technology, even though it's extremely important. And we have to have it. It's critical. But I do think that we still have to get people to do the right things in the first place, which requires a preventive strategy and legal strategy as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. We need the assistance of the governments. The judicial system may be the most decisive system to bear on this issue. The consumer demands for authenticity are also crucial. So I think there are multiple factors that have to coalesce. This type of economically motivated adulteration involves broad international conspiracies and collusions. That is known, and people understand the mechanisms of that more than before. So I think it's this confluence of events that are needed. So science is a crucial foundation without which it's hard to make the legal case. That's why so many people engaged in fraud tried to keep NMR and other technologies out of the toolbox because it could expose and demonstrate the illegality of the types of honey.
The technology can also really help on the litigation as well. So as Ron mentioned, it really is a confluence. You have to have a lot of pieces going at the same time.
The good news, and the reason I put in my September International Market Report, which is being published in many countries now. It's on the Apimondia website already. I'm calling this as a sea change because we're seeing this.
Yeah, that's great to hear that things are coming together. So we're coming to the end of our time here. Do you guys have any final comments, anything you want to bring up? Give us a bit of a closing statement.
A couple of things I would want to stress. One is that, again, the consumer is the ultimate victim, as well as many of the honest purveyors of food, which would include honey producers, for example. They are also victims. So there are victims in this food fraud problem that really need to be recognized, because I think that they're the ones who have most at stake here. Secondly, that the problem is extremely complicated, and it's complicated because it's global, and it's complicated because we have a modern system that has a lot of different pieces to it, and the level of technology is really sophisticated. The third thing that I would want to mention that we haven't even actually talked about today, that I want to leave just to underscore all of the complexities here, and that is that we have a new engine of delivery of food that has really taken hold during the pandemic, and that is e-commerce. And e-commerce is going to actually allow for a lot more fraud than we have seen so far. Different kinds of fraud, and even the same kinds of fraud, but amplified and on a different level. And so now's the time to really get a handle on this. As you asked earlier, Will, where are we going with this? I sense a sense of urgency now that e-commerce has really become a part of food delivery and part of the food system in a way that we've never seen before. And for that reason, we really have to get a hold of it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And Ron, do you have a final comment?
Well, I'll say that Michael and I initiate this series of podcasts is an example of what is needed to solve the problem. The confluence of different types of expertise and integrity and seeking justice to battle the confluence of the opposite of those virtues. And I think this confluence is developing, but I think we're really at a sea change stage, and it's been achieved through a lot of effort, a lot of deep thought, and a lot of intelligence has been brought to bear. And I think those of us who are willing to engage in this battle, we're doing it with a sense that there's a deep moral and strategic value for fighting this. And we're glad that we have new tools, scientific tools, media tools, governmental tools, judicial tools to bring to bear so we can enter an era of greater justice in the food supply.
A big thank you to Professor Michael Roberts and Ron Phipps for sharing their thoughts and expertise with us on this topic. That was a really illuminating conversation for me. I hope it was the same for you listening. Again, if you work with honey or other products like wine or fruit juices and you want to learn more about how FoodScreener might be able to help you ensure the authenticity of your product, go to Bruker.com/FoodScreener and contact a Bruker expert to learn more. We will have more episodes of this Food Authenticity podcast coming soon, so stay tuned. And don't forget to go back and listen to all the previous episodes if you haven't already. Thanks for listening.